I want to start today by asking you a real quick question. If I was a pollster and I was to call you today and ask you how you think Congress is doing at its job, what would you say? Would you be one of the 76% of Americans who recently said that they disapprove of the work that Congress is doing? If you did, I wouldn't be surprised. That's a pretty high number. And it's so funny to watch that number evolve over time. In the 40 or so years that Gallup, for instance, has been tracking congressional job approval, it's gone up and down, and there's no surprise there. But there's been a clear trajectory, especially in recent years, toward a higher disapproval rating. And that's important for one reason, that we're kind of feeling down on what Congress is doing, right? And it's so funny if you look at what's been happening in current events around the time that those numbers tick up. There's almost always some big rallying type of event that goes on in the weeks and months immediately following 9/11. Before the 9/11 Commission, before the War on Terror, you saw an immediate bump in congressional job approval. High 80s, I think. What does that mean? Well, there surely impacts on how we think Congress is doing based off of universal experiences. There was a universal distrust of the executive in the entire Watergate scandal. And when you saw President Nixon resign, you saw an uptick in congressional job approval. There was an immediate impact of patriotism and nationalism in the wake of 9/11, and you saw a commensurate rise in congressional job approval. Right now, if oil was to hit $10 per barrel, I guarantee congressional job approval would skyrocket. Am I wrong? But at the same time that you see these ticks and these large unifying moments drive congressional job approval up, there's been a steady decline in the overall trajectory of congressional job approval. More often than not, we're not digging what they're doing out in Washington, D.C. And I bring that up because we all can kind of relate to that. It's easy for us to conceptualize how we feel about what's happening in Washington. But I want to pose a real question. What do you think those same members of Congress think of us when we engage in the advocacy process? Now, as a former congressional staffer, someone who's worked for members of Congress for close to 10 years, and now I'm a lobbyist, I've got a different take on this than you might expect. And it's largely informed by some data that was generated by the Congressional Management Foundation. If you're not familiar with who Congressional Management Foundation is, what that organization is, they are an organization that studies how Congress relates to those they represent. Kind of important if you are serious about making sure that the information you're providing in your advocacy program is impactful and effective. And what CMF has found over time, as they've studied the relationship between Congress and those they represent, is that more often than not, folks who come in as volunteer advocates are coming across as unprepared. In fact, they studied this with members of Congress and senior staff, and those folks, when responding to the survey from Congressional Management Foundation, reported that only about 12% of the advocates that they see come in on issues are well prepared for their meetings. That is low. And as much as we may hate on Congress for what we see or don't see coming out of Washington, I think there is something to be said about how those same folks who work in politics day in and day out see us when we try to engage in that realm. It's important, if you care about an issue, to present yourself in the best way possible. And that's why I create the content that I do. That's why I'm on social media and on my blog sharing tips and tricks on how to do advocacy better, because it's important to have credibility, to establish credibility with those decision makers in the room. So what does that 12% mean for you and for advocacy organizations? Well, up front, it's an indication that we may be putting the wrong type of focus on what we're doing to get ready for advocacy meetings. One of the big barriers for volunteer advocates is simply getting to the room. Oftentimes, especially if you're talking about going to Washington, D.C., there's a travel and lodging barrier that creates a cost problem for volunteer advocates to engage in an advocacy program. And you also have an intimidation factor. Going into the US Capitol is intimidating by design. It was built to instill a level of intimidation into visiting dignitaries. Well, guess what? That same intimidation impacts the average voter who might decide to weigh in on an issue and go in person to advocate. So we, as advocacy organizations, oftentimes have to focus on those physical and uh, institutional barriers to participation. And because of that, and because we only have so much time with our volunteer advocates, we oftentimes have to neglect a much more important part of preparation, and that's actually performance preparation. What do I mean by that? If you care enough about an issue to show up and go to Washington or to go to your state capitol and show up in person to advocate on it, don't you want to be prepared for when something goes wrong? I think this is an area that advocacy organizations and individuals alike should start thinking about more. We focus so much on that logistical prep and not on the performance prep that we neglect opportunities to take our volunteer advocates and train them appropriately and equip them for how to react in the moment. And this is something I'm trying to change. Again, this is why I create the content that I do. If you as an individual don't have the time to engage in meaningful practice, you're not going to be well prepared for the event. So advocacy organizations, when we get folks out to Washington, D.C., it's almost always a rush. Why? D.C. is super expensive. Getting there and staying there are expensive endeavors. So we want to maximize every minute that we have out there. And oftentimes that means we don't take the time to have our advocates rehearse what they're going to do in the room. And this is something I'm trying to change. I try to build in with my clients an opportunity for them to experience a role-playing exercise where they can actually go up against or meet with a mock member of Congress, and they can experience some of the little things that happen along the way that can throw off your meeting in a big way. What are some of those things? Well, as a staffer, I can tell you a big one is a lot of times your member of Congress gets pulled out of a meeting because they get called for a vote or some other discussion that has to happen. What happens in the room? How does your team react when the decision maker has to leave? That is an easy way that you can prepare your team in how to react so that your conversation doesn't get derailed. In the moment, in the room, if that were to happen, you're now sitting across the room, likely from a junior staffer, and your team has to be prepared to treat that 20 or early 30-something with the same respect that they would give the member of Congress. Practicing that goes a long way. Realistic practice can look a lot of different ways. I have my method where I help advocacy organizations develop a structure to the meeting and help them figure out how their team is going to gel. There are other folks who are going to tackle it a different way, but a government affairs professional or a lobbyist like me can help your volunteer advocates understand that process better, help them practice better, and I think it's something that we as individuals have to own. And that goes to the bigger purpose behind everything that I'm doing on social media and on my website. If we really believe that our political discourse, that our public discourse has to be better, has to be more civil, has to be more effective, we have to own the process of doing that. Elected officials can't do that for us. If we opt for the lowest common denominator in our behavior and we go for cheap tactics over long-term relationship building strategies, the onus is on us. And that may not be a popular opinion, but I've seen it in person. When individuals and organizations opt for long-term relationship building strategies, they get more opportunities. And that's where understanding how we are perceived by members of Congress and their senior staff becomes really valuable. If we're not willing to look in the mirror ourselves and address those shortcomings, we are setting our issue up for failure in the long term. I think you can get there. I think anyone who cares passionately about an issue enough to show up can get there. And little things like building in practice and committing to long-term relational strategies will get you there. But you have to understand that advocacy is an iterative and cumulative process. This is a really important point that I want to drive home that's going to help you stand apart from the 88% of advocates who are unprepared for their meetings. What do I mean by an iterative process? Advocacy conversations are never one and done. You have multiple touch points that you're going to have to work with folks on any given issue to see it advance, whether that's through a piece of legislation or through an administrative rule. You are never, on the first conversation, you're never likely going to get the mission done that first meeting. Instead, the folks who are digesting your issue for the first time are going to have questions. They're going to need more data. They're going to need to know who else is impacted. And that's the iterative process. You have one conversation, you get feedback in the room from that decision maker about what they need to know moving forward, and then you come back to them with that data. And that sets up the cumulative nature of advocacy. Cumulative work in advocacy is consciously committing to a long-term strategy and engaging multiple times over multiple years, if necessary, and owning that responsibility for yourself. And, volunteer advocates who are deeply passionate about issues, this is where you can really stand out. If you are volunteering for an advocacy organization that has a concept of district captains, where they identify a specific person or team who are always going to be the folks who are meeting with a congressional staff, you need to get on that team. You need to be that captain, because that person becomes the person who owns the responsibility of getting to know and getting to develop relationships with those key staff. And the importance of that cannot be overstated. Those staff, when they are thinking about your issue, if you want to be the first person they call, you have to buy into the cumulative nature of advocacy. 76% is high. When we think about how we think of Congress and what they do, that shouldn't be the number where we stop. We should also be invested in how we are perceived by those politicians. Yes, they are there to serve the people. They are there to hear from the people. They are there to represent the people. But the people are more than just who's on our side of the issue. And we have to understand that. And we have to own the process of getting better if we're going to stand out and get ourselves into that 12% category of folks who are well prepared and credible advocates on their issues. If you've never seen my content before, I hope you found this video helpful. I am new to this and I promise to get better. I hope that I'm providing you a new way of thinking about politics and advocacy, because I genuinely believe that we can equip individuals, nonprofits, associations, and people on the street with how to do this better. And when we do that, we're going to force everyone to elevate their game. And I want to see that happen. I take heat sometimes from colleagues in the lobbying profession. Why are you giving away the tips and the tricks of our trade? Well, because I want our trade, I want our industry to have to compete better. When we do that, our politics will have to be better. I believe it, and I hope you do too, and I hope that you will connect with me on other social channels, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on TikTok. Yeah, I'm even on TikTok. It's probably the most boring TikTok page you're ever going to visit, but I'm there. And I would love to connect with you on those platforms. I will commit to continuing to putting content out there that I think adds value as you look at how you can jump into politics, because it's daunting. And I get that. And even though I've been in this game now for more than a dozen years, it's still intimidating. And I want to help you avoid mistakes that I made along the way. I want to help you stand out as professional and well prepared. And I want to make sure that even if we disagree on an issue, that you're able to put your best foot forward for the issues that you give a damn about.